It feels weird just to kind of read or go to a manuscript with 15 people or 12 people. It's like it's okay. Is that okay? It's okay to see 2 or 3 out of 40 that go to sleep, but it's not okay to see 2 or 3 out of 10. So I'll try not to just read. Okay. So and as interactive as we need to make this, or would like to make this, I encourage you to do so. If there's something, we just changed these batteries. I'm sorry. Can you all hear me if I speak like this? No, Tim, I know you can hear me. Not that interactive, Tim. No. So as we start, I guess I'll just kind of jump in. It was a question posed to me by a New Testament professor of mine who asked this question. I'll ask you all the same question. She said, which came first, the church or the New Testament? Now, for many Protestants, this comes as a shocker, because for us, Scripture is not just authority, but almost a preeminent sort of origin of all things. And this may come as a shocker, but the question is actually pretty clear. Which came first, the church or the New Testament? The church. Likewise, drilling down even further, which came first, the church or the Gospels? Jesus, of course, is the origin and source of the Christian faith, but all of our Gospels really flow through the church. The church, in very, very deep ways, shaped what we understand and shaped what we read. It was filtered through. These stories weren't as though they came from a historian dictating, everything that was happening. These stories came from the church that would meet together, that would break bread together, that would share things in common, that was fledgling and struggling at times. And so much of these stories are filtered through that first century church. And so as we read some of these, especially post-resurrection accounts, we ask ourselves, why is this account important? And what was the first century church rhetorically doing? Rhetorically doing means, what were they trying to say and really get people to understand or believe in these stories? For those of you who study, literary criticism, this is called rhetorical criticism. What is this writing trying to get us to understand, believe, or do? What's its rhetoric? Looking specifically at John 21, the disciples again are gathered together with an eye toward what the church is trying to do here. This time, the disciples are not isolated. Luckily, they did go out, right? But they went out to go fishing. They recognized Jesus, but again, not at first. The man by the lake tells them to cast their nets on the other side, similar to what we've heard in previous gospel readings. The disciples do, and they end up catching a load of fish. Peter is the first to recognize the man on the seashore as the resurrected Jesus. And strangely enough, to jump into the water, he puts on his clothes, which always confuses me, which means he's fishing naked. So were the other disciples fishing naked too? It's always kind of quite a scene, right? What was the church saying there? I don't know. But anyway, Peter and the other disciples arrive back at the shore to see Jesus cooking fish, breaking bread, and inviting them back into ministry, reversing the denials of Peter. Peter, do you love me? 3 times. In this sacred event, there are loads of symbolism and loads of rhetoric that the church is trying to put forward. And I don't want us to miss this, why it's important for them then, and how it can be important for us now. So the symbolism, okay? I bet some of you already know the symbolism, and if we can interact in this way. In John 21, what symbolism or similarities did you see with other previous events from any gospel account is fine, anything off the top of your head? What symbols were there or mere reflections of what had happened previously? I know, it's uncomfortable to be put on the spot. Okay.
Moses did.
loaves of fish. Wonderful. Loaves of fish are happening. Where Jesus fed the multitude. And there was plenty to go around.
Peter's jumping into a lake or a sea.
Yeah. And you catch that, walking on water. When Peter jumped in to Jesus, Lord, help me. And of course Peter falls, but at this time he just jumps in, maybe he doesn't try to walk. Yeah, Drew. Great. Yeah, others.
That's right. There's been a number of references to sheep previously.
Sheep. Very interesting. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And the sheep are the ones who hear my voice, earlier in John 10. So there's sheep allusions. What else do you guys see? There's all kinds of these parallels and symbolisms going on. And those three I didn't even have in my sermon. Just to show you how good you all are. Any others? I'll throw one, or unless somebody has. The charcoal fire. The charcoal fire, the last time a charcoal fire, the only time a charcoal fire is in any scene was in Peter's denial. So when he denies he's actually at a charcoal fire as he's being accused or kind of in a, what do you call it? An attorney, lawyer, judgment, a court, in the court. Okay, what other symbolism or allusions? Got a bunch. Okay, I'll mention two others. The breaking of the bread, right? Tim, you mentioned this, but it's also, anytime you hear the breaking of the bread, it's an allusion to communion, to the act of that first century church that was being reiterated and given import there in that scene as well. Charcoal fire I mentioned, and then again the denial. I think we did mention that, the 3 times, which is very specific. So Peter then denied Jesus 3 times. Are you one of his disciples? No, I'm not. And now 3 times again, he's saying, yes, I will follow him. I will. Then feed my sheep. So this symbolism, I believe, marks a few things. One is a community of forgiveness. Restarts, starting over. 2, it establishes Peter as the authority within this first century church. And it gives him and the community some assurances that the resurrected Jesus expressed that same thing. And Peter, after hearing Jesus' voice, the resurrected Jesus' voice, can again claim some authority. And then 3 is that they're beginning to build trust once again with the disciples, with the fledgling church. Trust, authority, forgiveness are all happening in this moment. Our second son, as you may know, is named Wiley. Wiley is an apropos name for him in every sense of the word, but he was not named for that reason. In fact, when I was at school at Wake Forest, there was a benefactor named Wiley Guthrie. Wiley is now deceased. He's passed some 8 or 9 years ago, and was a wonderful man. In fact, he was one of the first hospice chaplains in North Carolina. As hospice itself was coming. In fact, hospice didn't even start until, I think, in this country, 1978. Okay? It started in 1978 with a movement from England into the United States. And Wiley was one of the first. He was a wonderful man. We ended up going golfing together. He was always kind, and he helped me pay for some of my education. And we just thought he was a genuine human. And so we named our second son Wiley, after Wiley Guthrie. However, Wiley, our son, who also has autism, is ornery. He sneaks everything. He's mischievous, but he never tells lies. He's always honest about his lies. Okay, he is very honest in the way that he sneaks, whether it's food or screens or his computer. He'll sneak anything, and he's quite good at it. One of the more recent developments that we've experienced is how he's been coping with emotions. Okay? So emotions, he at times calls them the fake imaginary people. Dad, they say things. We say, no, son, they're emotions. You're angry, or you're hurt, or you're sad, or you're frustrated. And those are all normal things. Well, one of the coping mechanisms that he developed about a year ago, for whenever he made mistakes mistakes or was mischievous or stole something or took something or brought food, and sometimes we'll find candy wrappers upstairs. We almost have to have a lock but we decided not to go that route. But he will sneak anything, and then we know to look. In fact, I even labeled a drawer for him called Where to Hide Things. Okay, so he has all of his drawers labeled, saying, know where his socks are, you can put them back, and where to hide things, and he really does hide things in that drawer. So it's really sweet, right? So he hides things in it. But one of the ways he was dealing with his emotions when he was getting in trouble is he would change his self. So he learned that at that time, he actually kind of developed a tissue box system, where he'd have a tissue box system, and on that one face of the tissue box was the name Wiley. And then on the other was Wiley 2.0. And then on the other side was a man he created named Doo-Doo. Okay? And on the other was Woo. And so at each time that Wiley would get in trouble, he would get angry, he would get frustrated, get a little sad, and to cope, he'd go upstairs and he'd turn the tissue box so that it would face from Wiley to Wiley 2.0. And then it was his new self, his new persona. It was a way of coping with his mistakes, with his failures, with the times that he had cheated, or stopped, did something he wasn't supposed to do, and he'd come back down and say, Mom, Dad, I'm not Wiley anymore. I'm Wiley 2.0. And I think he was dealing with things and handling some of the incongruities that we all know. Incongruities in ourselves, incongruities with how we feel sometimes. The space between our expectations, maybe of who we would be and who we are. The expectations between what we thought we would do and what we did. And for Wiley, that tissue box was able to save him because he knew that starting over takes time. But for him, it was just a twist of the tissue box. Peter was at a similar place in the midst of this fledgling church to trust and to begin to establish trust once again after it was broken. Throughout the Gospel of John, there's the disciple who Jesus loves, sometimes called the beloved disciple, and then there's Peter and the others. And Peter is not the beloved disciple. It's clear throughout the Gospel of John. The distinction between Peter and the beloved disciple may in fact highlight some of the internal communal disputes about who had authority within that first century church. Yes, the church had everything to do with the Gospels. Peter's leadership is in question, and it needs to be done, and there's no tissue box that can be turned quickly. There's no Peter 2.0. So if you're wondering why this scene on the shore takes place, it has everything to do with trust, as I mentioned, establishing a clear leader, and undoing some of the knocks on Peter's personality or Peter's decision. In other words, they weren't too sure about this guy, and they needed something rhetorically that would define him as the church's head. Here it is. So let the symbolism flow, the illusions happen. All of it's taking place to reestablish that this resurrected Jesus is giving, and almost like a good bit of the Gospels are happening in this moment. Whether it's the water, walking on the water, it's the fish, it's the breaking of the bread, it's a second call, right? Like throw your nets on the other side. Very similar to the first call of the disciples. It's a new call. It's a revisiting so many of the different themes in the Gospels that it's happening again where Peter would begin to take life, right? It's a second opportunity. Because starting over is hard. And that's part of Peter's work. It was part of the church's work. Starting over is part of our work. A theme in our collective culture right now, I don't know if you've seen it, and maybe I'll ask you all to name some places that you've seen that are starting over right now. And I'll give you a few examples. Just yesterday, on Thursday, I was at my 9-year-old son's 4th grade presentation. So he had a poem up, a little 6-word memoir that he had done. He made little pancakes out of pottery, and they were showing it all. And all the parents were walking around so proud of all the different students and proud just to be in that classroom. And we realized how much this whole school and teachers had been starting over. There were a group of young people that were a part of a jump roping team. This jump roping team was one of a very kind of few selective renowned jump roping groups called the Sparks, the Dublin Sparks. All of our 9-year-old son wanted to join it, but the demands were just exorbitant. We couldn't actually undertake this for Oliver at the time, who was 7, who wanted to join us, because they met 2 to 3 times a week. They traveled to Missouri. They did all kinds of stuff. We said, Oliver, it's too much, right? And this Sparks jump roping crew, as they lined up, had 9 students. And they asked each one of these Sparks members to say how long they had been jumping. And there were only 2 of the 9 who it was not their first year. And I saw the teacher, who was probably in her 60s, step back, maybe a little tired, maybe a little not ready to start a program back over again, but with these 9 students, knowing that that was part of her call, that she was starting over with these students. We see it in restaurants. We see it in my son's orchestra. We see it in social clubs. We see it in work, in jobs. We see it with churches. This week, Ken and I went to meet a college ministry, a college group called Jacob's Porch. Jacob's Porch is a Lutheran campus ministry that has 2 established full-time campus ministers. They do a wonderful job. They're very involved in the community. Julie's just shaking his head, so I think they're a known entity. Is that right?
Yep.
They spend a lot of their time on campus. They have a sofa where the students are able to tell their stories. At the time, before the pandemic, they had 50, on average, students attending their church. Now they have 12. Jacob's not the head of it. In fact, his name's Grant and Sammy. We're hoping that one of them is going to come and share and preach this summer, because we want to be involved in our neighborhood. But they said it's hard. We're starting over. And we didn't just lose that time. For them, they lost half of a 4-year cycle. They lost half of their opportunity to really minister and to meet people's needs. Starting over is hard. Building trust is hard. Establishing trust in relationships as a church, and I do think the church has work to do to establish trust. There's many reasons and ways that we do as well. So how did the first century church handle this issue of trust, question of leadership, an issue of needing to start again, moving from out in the boat and fishing to out in the world and loving? Well, it's striking to me what's not said. There's no verbal shaming. Jesus did ask him 3 times, and the 3rd time Peter did get a little upset. Come on, give me a break here. But he didn't say, Peter, you should have known better. I told you. I told you it was going to happen. I warned you. How can I trust you again? There were no tactics like stonewalling that we often use in relationships. Stonewalling, the cold shoulder. There wasn't criticizing. There wasn't blaming. There wasn't shaming. There's no air of superiority. Just the voice of the resurrected Jesus, restoring a relationship, again, reversing a denial, over a charcoal fire, and the breaking of the bread after a second call, after Peter jumps into the water and swims with his clothes on. Forgiveness is central to the story. But it's not the only part of the story. The flip side of forgiveness is that Peter had his work cut out for him to begin to reestablish trust and to build trust within this community. In fact, there are times, I think, when the Christian message of forgiveness, it's the only way forward. At times for the victim and victimizer. But there are other times I fear that Christians have taken the message of forgiveness to a place of unhealth. The reality of forgiveness is that there are times when trust must be earned and reestablished. When forgiveness isn't just a given, but there's work left to be done for a relationship to happen. And there can be forgiveness, yes, and relationship, no. Forgiveness is not an anesthetic to reality, and And it's not a magical eraser of all wrongs that every Christian must do at all times. Starting over, even with forgiveness, takes work. It did for Peter, it did for the church, and it does for us now. The church then and now has its work cut out for it. Peter then and church leaders now have their work cut out for them today. So going back to Wiley, and I'll end here. The tissue box sides were entertaining for the first week, but then as week 1 went into week 2, and from 2 times a day of switching that box went to 4 to 5 to 7 times a day, and new characters were created, we started to realize that he was having problems integrating the good and the bad into his identity. We began to realize that every time he snuck or messed up, that he was changing his sense of self, not able to fully begin to realize that, Wiley, yeah, you are kind of hard, and it's okay. You are a little mischievous, but you always tell the truth. And Wiley, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to have failures. And this journey, that's a part of life, and it's okay. And we still love you, and God still loves you, and it's okay. There's just one Wiley. There's really just one tissue box. And sometimes I think we as the church need to do that too. It's okay. There's going to be failures. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be times when we have to start over and start again. There's going to be work done of building trust, of reestablishing trust. And it's okay. But we never told Wiley it's okay to cheat, because there is still work left to be done. And I think there's 2 sides of that. There's always forgiveness. And there's always work that's left to be done to reestablish the trust. So for those of you who may be in a place of starting over again, perhaps physically you're starting over again, maybe a relationship you're starting over again, maybe a club, maybe it's work. Be patient with yourself. Be gracious with yourself, knowing like Peter and like Wiley, like you and me, denials, doubts, mistakes are a part of our journey. And on the flip side, be willing to put in the work of building the trust back, of going to places you may not wish to go, which was a warning to Peter. Starting over is hard, but the good and gracious God, who is always ready, there to break bread with us, to speak a word of forgiveness, and say, now get back in there, kid. Feed my sheep.